This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe. With me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we speak with Lauren Starkey, a campaigner and independent social worker who works with Albanian victims of human trafficking. Lauren is going to tell us how the UK government decided that Albanian men shouldn't be granted asylum into the UK, even if they are victims of human trafficking. She tells us how this approach punishes victims of human trafficking, forces them to live in destitution, and threatens to send them back to an environment they were trafficked from. And we also have an addendum at the end of this episode in which we talk about Labour's reported plans to send asylum seekers to Albania, though Labour is denying this at the moment. Alright, so before we get into today's episode, I'll just go through the usual rigmarole. I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a news blog that hasn't been updated for a while, but you can go check it out at civilfleet.com. That's civilfleet.com, go check it out. There's interviews, there's no breaking stories. We've got interviews on there, we have news reports, we have exclusive stories and all kinds of things. So go check out civilfleet.com. Also, if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing, you can support us by making a small donation. You can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet. You can make a small donation of the price of a coffee, or you can donate the cost of a flight to Hawaii if you like. To do that, go to ko-fi.com. Our costs at the Civil Fleet are incredibly small, but any help you can give us, any donations you can give us will be greatly appreciated. Alright, that's enough rambling from me. On with the show. Lauren Starkey, shall we get started? Are you ready?
Absolutely, let's go.
Alright, Lauren Starkey, thank you very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Lauren, you are an independent social worker and you focus, I think you say you're a specialist, or you focus on Albanian boys and young men, mainly Albanian asylum seekers. Is that right?
Yes, so my background is in anti-trafficking work, and what I discovered through the course of that work was that there was a real issue facing this particular group of young people. So I ended up specialising in supporting this group and working alongside Albanian community organisations. And I also wrote my master's and addressed this very subject of whether or not the UK care system in particular is adequately protecting Albanian boys and young men who are at risk of trafficking and exploitation. So it kind of became a bit of a niche interest for me. And I've ended up working quite specifically in this field.
Yeah, it's quite specific. I think we spoke on the phone before recording a few days ago, and you said that you got really niche. It's a really interesting thing to be focused on, particularly I think. And so we're going to talk about how asylum seekers and victims of trafficking from Albania are treated differently in the UK. But as you kind of mentioned a little bit now, but can you tell us, I like to ask people when they come on the podcast to give us a bit of their background and tell us about themselves. So yeah, how did you get involved in this? How did you get so into such a niche subject?
It came about because I'm a qualified social worker and I was working in a local authority that had a port of arrival, and I was in the unaccompanied minors team. So we were picking young people up on arrival and taking them into care and looking after them. And I noticed some issues in the way that Albanian young people's cases were handled, both within the care system, within the asylum system, within the trafficking identification systems. And I was really shocked by it. I think I have a bit of a kind of underdog complex. And what I was seeing was this one particular group of young people were having really, really poor outcomes. In a way that wasn't reflected more generally across other groups of young people. There were always individual cases of people from other countries whose cases would be handled badly or whose outcomes were really poor. But it seemed to be much more systemic across the population of Albanian young people. And then you would hear statistics about, Albanians being the highest number of foreign national offenders in prisons and things like that. But what I was seeing was really, really extremely vulnerable, exploited young people being criminalised for things that under various pieces of modern slavery legislation they shouldn't have been criminalised for. And I kind of got this real fire in me, actually directly related to the young people I was working with. I always like to say, although I specialise in this subject, I'm not the expert in it. My young people are the experts in it. And I was working with these incredible young people who were just being beaten down by this awful system. And that was kind of how I ended up specialising in what I did. So I went from local authority work to a small NGO that was called Love 146 in the UK that worked with specifically trafficked young people. And it was there that I really specialised in working with our Albanian cohort. Unfortunately, Love 146 went into insolvency a couple of years ago. And since then, I've continued working alongside Albanian community organisations and also been working independently. So I do expert reports and consultation and independent support for young people. Because what happened over the past couple of years, which we will get into later in the podcast, is that the situation for Albanian young people in the UK considerably worsened. And so through that kind of journey that I was taking, that yes, was kind of part of my professional development, but for the most part was almost entirely led by the young people that I was working with and what I was seeing they needed and how I felt I could be useful to them.
And so, that what I was working for this what did you say it was called? Sorry, something 146.
Love 146. So Love 146 is actually a US-based charity, and in the US they work with the cohorts they have over there. And so we had a small kind of UK offshoot that was affiliated to but not directly part of the US organisation. And unfortunately, the UK branch went into insolvency a couple of years ago. But the work it was doing was really incredible. It's an unfortunate casualty of the total crisis facing charities these days.
Yeah, that's really sad. Like, it sounds like I've not heard of it before, but it sounded like you were doing some really important work there. And I guess you've been able, so now you said you're an independent social worker, right? And what does that involve?
So I can be commissioned by anyone, really. Either a lot of my work comes through kind of lawyers and solicitors who need expert reports, so assessments of young people and their needs, generally when they're going through kind of legal systems. But also local authorities can commission me. They can say they've got a particular young person who has some needs that kind of need a bit of extra attention, particularly if it's around trafficking and exploitation. And so they can get me in to kind of do some work with that young person, do an assessment, provide some additional support. And actually a lot of what I do is kind of public advocacy. Social workers in general are not public figures. It's quite a private profession because it's generally so family focused. And so it's quite unusual to kind of be a public advocate as a social worker. But what I was seeing was real public need for advocacy on this issue from people who most directly work with those affected. We hear lots of kind of media professionals and policy heads and those kinds of people advocating. What you rarely hear is directly from people who are affected. And for many reasons they can't, but as a social worker, my job is to advocate for those groups of young people. And when you see really, really serious public issues that have a direct impact on your young people, I found it quite hard to sit back and not say anything. So I've also partly ended up doing quite a lot of advocacy work.
Which is really important, right? Like you said, like it can be quite difficult. I know from a journalism perspective, it's often easier to get people on like yourself, for journalists to contact people like yourself, and it's much harder to find someone who can speak English and who can tell you a person on the move. It's like that can be difficult, and I think a lot in the media is often they don't want to talk to them. It's too difficult, I suppose.
And also too high risk. I mean, there are two things. A lot of the people I work with are children, so there are obviously real restrictions around speaking to them publicly. But also even for adults, I think what's really important to remember, and I had to repeat this a lot actually over the past few years where this issue became so public and lots of journalists were contacting me and asking if they could speak to someone directly. You have to remember that a lot of these people are at really, really high risk. They're extremely vulnerable and they are in fear for their lives. And the idea of speaking publicly about what they've been through, I mean, one, the idea of it is just so re-traumatizing, the idea of having to explain what's happened to them. But the idea of doing so when they're very much still in it, they're still at risk, there is still the possibility that they are going to be returned to the place where their exploitation and trafficking started, and they believe their lives are at risk. It's just impossible for those people ethically to be in a position to share those stories publicly.
Yeah, like I was in Bosnia recently, and I was meeting a lot of people on the move, and that was something about re-traumatizing people is something I thought a lot about. So I didn't just walk up to someone and like shove a microphone in their face. I thought that would be brutal. So, you get talking to them first and then ask if they want to and agree what you're not going to talk about and this kind of thing. So yeah, that can be difficult. And this is something I think about quite a lot. And this is completely off topic, but this is what I like to do. I think sometimes I'm not sure how useful it is. Actually, after Bosnia, I feel differently, but sometimes I used to wonder how useful it is to talk to people on the move. If they're in a situation, or if they're in a bad situation still, how useful it is for journalists to talk to them. I wonder what your thought is on that. Like, I used to think it was only a good idea to speak to people when they were safe. I mean, this is totally like off topic, but I wonder what you think.
I have really complicated thoughts on it because I think it's really important to understand the needs of people on the move and what's happening right now. But I also, first and foremost, our responsibility has to be to the safety and welfare and well-being of the humans that we're interacting with. And I think what often gets forgotten, and part of the reason I find a lot of the media coverage of small boat arrivals so objectionable, is that people do just have their photos taken and have microphones shoved in their faces and get asked to be kind of the public face of this issue without really very much opportunity to think about what that means for them. And I think you can end up being very exploitative because you have to really carefully consider, why do I want to speak to this person? And I think, from a social work perspective, my first priority always has to be the best interests of the people that I'm supporting. So I completely understand when there's a story to be told and you want to hear from the people who are at the heart of it. Absolutely, for the sake of the story and for the sake of the public understanding of it, it makes sense to try and speak to them. But my question would always be, what's in it for them? And if there's no benefit to them, if it's not in their best interests, then I would say this is a person who is in a really, really, really vulnerable situation at one of the lowest points in their lives. Now's probably not the time.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, when I went to Bosnia, I met a lot of people that were in really, they were homeless, basically getting beaten up by border guards and stuff, and living in the underground, basically. And I would talk to them normally just about whatever we were talking about, and then like if they were opening up to me, I would ask them, and a few people said no, most people said yes, and I think it depends on the type of media as well. Like, because I do a podcast, a microphone is a lot less exposing than like a camera. So yeah, that's something I think about quite a lot, and I think you're right. You have to think about their situation, and you can't be exploitative about it. I think I'd really dislike you. I remember seeing a report. I don't remember if it was Sky or BBC or someone, but they were in a boat and there was people crossing the channel in a rubber boat, and the journalist was shouting across to the people in the boat. And I just remember thinking that's so irresponsible and so exploitative. Like, if that boat sinks, are they just going to film it or are they going to help?
Exactly.
I'm sure they would help. But yeah, it just felt, really exploitative. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. I think this is something we should get in quite early on. The difference between smuggling and trafficking. I think I know the difference. but I know a lot of journalists mess this up. And I think there's a legal distinction. A lot of people just use them for the same thing. But can you tell us the difference between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really, really important because the two are constantly being used interchangeably and they are not interchangeable terms. And it becomes really problematic when politicians who are making the policy and and legislating on these issues don't understand the difference. So the difference is smuggling is a process in which a person is moved across a border for their own benefit and in which they are free to leave at the end of it. So that is generally what we think of in terms of people paying to make a crossing. They pay a smuggler, the smuggler takes them across, and then they leave. And now that process is often rife with violence and exploitation. Smuggling is not an ideal scenario for anyone to find themselves in, but it's a different scenario than trafficking. Trafficking is when a person is moved and exploited for the benefit of someone else. And so that is the kind of scenario in which someone doesn't have the money to move, or they are tricked into moving. They're deceived with offers of work and things like this, and they're not free to leave at the end of it. They have an obligation, and they are forced into exploitative labour, and that can be, sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, criminality, organ harvesting, domestic servitude, these exploitative environments where they aren't free to leave and they are working for the benefit of someone else. So quite a succinct way of putting it is often that in smuggling you are the customer, in trafficking you are the product that is being bought and sold. That's the primary difference. And it is very important because there are different protections that apply to those who are trafficked.
Absolutely, yeah. Can you describe what those are? Like in a moment, I think we'll move on to specifically what's happening to Albanian people in the UK. But what if, like, just in general, if you're a victim of trafficking, what's supposed to happen in the UK?
Yeah, there's some quite technical terms I'm going to use. So actually, this is a really good opportunity to explain them before I keep using them and people are listening going, what is she talking about? So when a person is identified as a potential victim of trafficking, we have a system in the UK called the National Referral Mechanism, or the NRM. It's a term you'll hear me use a lot. The NRM is the UK system for identifying survivors and victims of trafficking. Now, what happens is if you are identified as a potential victim, so if you encounter the authorities, and there are certain organisations and authorities that have the power to make NRM referrals, so it's the police, it's the Home Office, local authorities and certain designated charities, they make a referral for you to the NRM and you get a two-part decision from the NRM. The first part is called a reasonable grounds decision, and the threshold for that is on the balance of probabilities, I think it's possible that this person is a victim of trafficking. Now, when you get a positive reasonable grounds decision, you're entitled to certain protections and supports. So you get what's called a reflection and recovery period, in which you will be provided with accommodation if you need it, financial support if you need it, often a support worker to help you navigate various systems, psychological support if you need it. Those support systems are not perfect, but they're designed to keep people safe whilst they're going through the identification process. And then what happens is after no less than 45 days, so you should have at least 45 days of reflection and recovery, then you should get the second part of the decision, which is the conclusive grounds decision, which is where everything's been kind of looked at, all the evidence you've put forward has been examined, and the NRM says conclusively, yes, we believe you've been a victim of trafficking. That is supposed to come sort of no less than 45 days. At the moment, the wait is around 500 odd days. There are really, really serious delays in NRM decision making, which have an incredibly detrimental impact on survivors. But that's what is supposed to happen. That's how the protection system is supposed to work. And many people who are going through the NRM will also claim asylum, because one of the major issues we have with support for trafficking survivors in the UK is that when you get a conclusive grounds decision from the NRM, you are automatically supposed to be considered for a grant of leave to remain. And there are certain conditions you have to meet to be able to be granted that leave to remain. But it's for a very limited period of time. It's not long term. It's the maximum, if I remember off the top of my head correctly, is about 2.5 years that you can get leave to remain from the NRM. And so as a survivor of trafficking who believes they would be at really, really serious risk of being re-trafficked on return home, 2.5 years isn't enough. And so trafficking survivors are often forced into the asylum system because they need a route to permanent long-term protection in the UK.
And I think there's two things I want to say, and hopefully I can remember them both. Leave to remain is that basically means you have a visa status that you're allowed to leave the country and come back, right?
No, so leave to remain is another one of those technical terms. It's basically you have permission to stay. So it's a bit of a funny term. We call it, you have leave. But weirdly, it means the exact opposite. It means you have permission to stay.
Yeah, it's really strange. I have some members of my family that were born in the States, and they have that kind of. I'm sure they have that in their passport or something. So that's what I think I used to. Or I've probably got it confused with something else. But whenever I hear that term, I know what it means. It means the person can stay. But I always thought the leave bit meant you can come back in the UK.
I mean, it does. Once you have leave to remain, you can get things like if you get refugee status, you get a refugee travel document, which functions similarly but not quite the same as a passport. It allows you to travel and come back into the UK. But the specific term leave to remain actually just means you've got permission to stay in the country.
It's a strange term, isn't it? Leave to remain.
It's not until you point. It's not until someone points it out you think, yeah, that is a really weird term.
So you said that a lot of victims of trafficking end up in the UK asylum system. So I guess that means that people that are victims of trafficking have obviously probably have different needs to people who've been smuggled in or smuggled themselves in. They might have a lot of psychological trauma and stuff. And we've done on the podcast, we've done a few episodes on the situation of asylum seekers being held in, like, being kept in hotels and what that's like. But these people, they're going to need support, right? Like, if they're just stuck in the hotel, there's no support in those places. There's very little support in those places. It must be really difficult, right?
Yeah, it is. Everyone across the refugee and asylum seeker support sector has been banging this drum for years. The hotels are wildly inappropriate environments for traumatized people. It's one of those funny things that the kind of anti-migration, anti-refugee side of the debate seems to suggest that those who support refugees are all really happy for them to, be put up in luxurious hotels and that kind of thing. Except that's what absolutely no one is saying. One, the hotels are not luxurious, but two, none of us want people living in hotels. It's a wildly unsuitable environment. We want people safely accommodated in communities where they can form friendships, where they can get into education, where they can, become a real part of the community, because that is what supports them best in their recovery. Now, that applies across the spectrum of people claiming asylum. But one of the biggest problems when it comes to survivors of trafficking is one of the greatest risk factors for trafficking is having been trafficked before, because you end up with such inherent vulnerabilities as a result of a trafficking experience. The hotel environment impoverishes people by design. It keeps them living in unsuitable environments. They get £8 a week to live on. 8. All their meals are supposed to be provided for them in the hotels, but the food is dreadful. And what it means is that people are incredibly easy to exploit from these environments, because all it takes is for someone to contact them and say, we know you're living in really, really terrible circumstances. We know someone who can get you work. If you come with us, we'll take you somewhere. We'll get you work. We'll give you money. Your situation will be better. And it's actually, there have been legal judgments in which people unfortunately see this issue entirely the wrong way round. People often think, well, if you've been deceived and trafficked before, you're less likely for that to happen to again, because you've learnt your lesson. You know how it happens. You're not going to fall for it again. It's actually the exact opposite. You're far more vulnerable to it happening again if it's happened in the past, because of trauma, because of the impact that it has on a person's sense of self, on their ability to trust, on their desperation. Putting trafficking survivors in these hotels and forcing them into poverty makes them really, really high risk of being re-trafficked.
Yeah, like you said, I think a lot of people, particularly, well, maybe I think on the far right, they just exploit it. But I think a lot of people some people think that the migrants, the asylum seekers, the people on the move in these hotels are like on holiday. I think they might be picturing somewhere they've been on holiday and think that this is what it's like for them. They're chilling by the pool with a pina colada. But that's not what it's like at all.
Not even a little bit. No, I mean, I think people think about, exactly that, being in a hotel where, housekeeping come and change your bedding for you every day and provide you with fresh towels in shape of swans, and you're all inclusive. And that's not what happens. When these hotels are taken over, generally the housekeeping teams are dismissed. There isn't someone coming and changing your bedding. There aren't washing facilities like that. People can't do their own laundry. They can't make their own meals. I've dealt with a lot of situations, for example, with families who are living in hotels where parents want nothing more than to be able to cook a meal for their children, and they're not able to because they don't have access to the kitchens. New mothers who aren't even allowed to have microwaves in their room to heat up food that they've been able to get from food banks for their babies. And they're not allowed to do that. You're basically prevented from being able in any way to support yourself or provide for your family. And that's what is so counterintuitive about our entire approach, is the right talks about migrants as a drain on the system and they're costing us all this money. We force them to be entirely dependent. We do not allow people to support themselves in any way. We don't allow them to work. We don't allow them to rent accommodation. Those living in the hotels, we don't even allow them to cook their own meals. We force them to be reliant on subsistence that we provide to them. And I have never met a single person who actually wants to be in that position. The vast majority of them want to be able to work and support themselves and live with basic human dignity. The situation is extremely dehumanizing, and people feel that their dignity is really, really taken from them in these environments.
And they must feel trapped, right? And yeah, that would just be just stuck in limbo, because the asylum system, it takes you years as well, right, to get your claim sorted out.
Exactly. And you have to remember, when it comes to trafficking survivors, these are people whose agency has already been taken away from them, who have been forced into situations they didn't want to be in with no way out. They have felt trapped. They have felt like they have no agency, no choice. And so when they arrive in the UK, either they, have escaped a trafficking situation elsewhere and come to the UK for safety, or they've been trafficked to the UK, they've managed to leave that situation and they're now seeking protection. In those scenarios, where we then force them into situations where they feel trapped, where they don't have choices, they often end up asking themselves, which is worse? Was it worse before, when I was being abused and exploited, or is it worse now? And people find this difficult to believe because of the violence that is involved in trafficking. But there are many, many times in which I've known people who've said, I would rather go back to that because I can't live like this. I'm treated like an animal. I have no rights. I had a young person a long time ago say to me, I came to the UK because I'd heard that it was the greatest country in the world for human rights. And I believed that if I came here, the rights that had been taken away from me, I would be able to get back. And instead, I'm treated like an animal.
That's really grim, yeah. And yeah, it's this really sad situation. And so when people are victims of, are suspected of being victims of human trafficking, there are some support that they're supposed to receive. But Albanian victims of human trafficking are not getting this, right? Can you kind of explain what that's like and why? I mean, that's quite a broad question.
Yeah, I mean, in a technical sense, they enter into the exact same trafficking protection system as everyone else. So they can be referred into the NRM. They are offered those protections once they're in it. The problem comes primarily in the asylum system because, as I mentioned earlier, because the NRM doesn't actually offer a pathway to settlement in the UK, to long-term protection, people are then forced into the asylum system as the only way to seek long-term protection in the UK. Now, to be granted asylum, there are certain conditions that you have to meet, right? There are kind of what are called convention reasons. So reasons under the 1951 Refugee Convention, where a person can be recognised as a refugee. Now, those grounds are your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership of a particular social group or political opinion. And if you fear persecution based on one of those grounds, you can be granted asylum in the UK. Now, the one that applies to survivors of trafficking is this term membership of a particular social group. That means you have an immutable characteristic. There is something about you that is inherent to you and cannot be changed, and that as a result of it, you fear persecution. That's where many Albanians enter the asylum system, and their reason is that they have the immutable characteristic of having been trafficked, and that means they would be at risk on return to Albania. The problem we have is that the government has decided unilaterally that Albania is a safe country and there is no reason for anyone from Albania to ever be granted asylum. That kind of doesn't fit with the patterns that we see and that what we know happens. So in 2022, the grant rate for Albanian asylum claims was 60%. So 60% of Albanians who entered the UK were granted asylum. Of the 40% who were refused, 57% of those claims succeeded on appeal. So the grant rate for Albania was actually relatively high. And that was primarily because so many people were recognised as victims of trafficking. And it's known that it's often very unsafe for victims of trafficking to return to the environment that they were trafficked from. So they would be granted protection. After the rise in small boat crossings in 2022, the government was kind of looking for someone to blame and point the finger at. And they saw these high numbers of Albanians and decided they're the ones. You know, there's no reason for them to be coming. Albania is a safe, prosperous European country, and we can get into how true that is next. But basically the government at the time decided to scapegoat Albanians and introduce new policies that say effectively Albanians shouldn't be granted asylum. And this is where there are some technical things at play here. So there is a law, which is the 2002 Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act. I always have to make sure I get that the right way around in my head. The 2002 Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act. Under Section 94 of that Act, an asylum claim can be what's called certified, which means that it's clearly unfounded. The claim was so clearly without merit and without substance that it was always bound to fail. And what it means when a claim is certified is that that person has no right to appeal the refusal of their asylum claim. In 2022-2023, the government changed their policy basically around the processing of Albanian asylum claims to say in particular that claims from Albanian men should always be certified. They've said effectively in their kind of trafficking information that's available, they've said trafficked women from Albania, their claims are unlikely to be certifiable. They should be granted right of appeal. Trafficked men should not be granted appeal. Their claims should be certified because Albania is a safe country. They can return. If they have any problems, they can get support in Albania. That runs entirely counter to what everybody who knows anything about this situation knows about the risk on return in Albania. So what we've ended up with is a situation in which we have Albanian nationals in the UK, many of whom are in genuine need of protection. And that's a contentious issue that I've debated a lot. The issue of, do Albanians have a genuine claim for asylum, genuine needs to protection? And it's a debate that I've always been totally willing to have, but I hold a very strong view on it that is based on evidence. And that's the difference, is the government's categorisation of Albania as a safe country is purely based on vibes. It's just, you know, you see TikTok videos of the beaches in Kasamil and Saranda. It looks really beautiful. You know, they've got 8 million tourists coming in a year at the moment. You know, it's on the rise. It's pure vibes. Albania is a safe country to visit as a tourist. Absolutely. I've been a couple of times. I had a very nice time. If you live there and you are growing up in poverty or in a dysfunctional family environment, there is absolutely no doubt. The evidence all points directly to the fact that it is not safe for people in those circumstances who become targets for organised criminal gangs. It's absolutely not safe, and return is not safe in every circumstance. So what has then happened is the government has this stated aim of crushing these evil trafficking gangs, but they're implementing an approach which punishes the victims, forces them to live in destitution, and threatens them with removal back to the very environment they were trafficked from. So we punish the victims, and in doing so, we allow the perpetrators to run free. Because the thing you need to be able to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice is for the victims to come forward and give evidence and give information to allow those prosecutions to happen. Well, if you're a victim of trafficking and you fear being returned to the environment you were trafficked from, and you know the same people are still there, the number one thing you will fear is they think I've talked. And so nobody talks. There is no involvement of Albanian trafficking victims in trying to bring Albanian traffickers to justice, because they are so terrified, because we are refusing to offer them any protection.
That is really tragic, isn't it? Like, and if a lot of the policies, particularly under the last government, and hopefully this new one's going to change that, but I'm not that confident. Like like you said, it's a lot of it's punishing the victims here, and it's really tragic to see. I don't know much about Albania. I think I know that it's the poorest country in Europe, but I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure how you would even define that, to be honest. Do you know if there's like state involvement or anything in the human trafficking stuff there, or is that I think I've listened to podcasts about gangs in there, but I can't remember the details at the moment. But yeah, can you describe? I mean, neither of us are Albanian, so this is difficult to describe. But is there? If there's state involvement there, or what's happening?
Yeah, there is. So the issue that Albania has is, you're absolutely right, it's an extremely poor country. I don't think it's the poorest. I think it might be the second poorest. I think Moldova might come below, but I'm not 100% confident on that. It's extremely poor. It has a very high youth unemployment rate, and that youth unemployment rate is getting higher by the day. There is systemic corruption throughout Albania, and a lot of the UK government's policies with regards to Albania are based on information provided to them by the Albanian government, and they don't seem to view that information with a critical eye. They've kind of just uncritically accepted what the Albanian government has said. But all the evidence tells us that there is systemic corruption within the Albanian political sphere, within the authorities, within policing, the judiciary. Corruption is systemic. And actually the Home Office itself accepts this. This is something that I have found really frustrating, is we see refusals of asylum claims for young Albanians where they say, I fear return to Albania because my traffickers can act with impunity, they can pay off the authorities, I would never be able to go to the police because, traffickers have connections to the police, it wouldn't be safe for me. And the Home Office will say, no, that's not true. Albania has passed laws, they're working on reforming the judiciary. If you needed anything, you could return. And they say things like, well, if you've been to one police station in the past and they were really corrupt and didn't help you and informed your traffickers, well, that's probably just the actions of one rogue police station. You should just go and try a different police station. That's the kind of thing you will see in asylum refusal decisions. But what's very interesting is that recently the former Prime Minister of Albania is a man named Sali Berisha. He has been banned from entering the US and the UK as a result of his ties to organised crime. Now, he's appealing that decision in the UK High Courts, and the UK is fighting him on it. And what's really interesting is, in reporting around that case, and in the documents submitted to the court in that case, the Home Office has submitted evidence saying, and I quote, the links between politics and crime in the Western Balkans create a permissive environment in which serious criminals and organised crime gangs can operate and benefit from the political protection of corrupt politicians from law enforcement activity. They say that, organised crime gangs have political protection, which gives them additional routes to launder money and enables them to use Albania as a safe haven from which to operate. In exchange, organised crime groups will help a politician during elections by buying votes and intimidating voters. Now, that's what the Home Office is accepting in a court case in which it wants to keep an Albanian national out of the country. But when Albanian nationals are here and they're saying that this is exactly what they fear, the Home Office denies that it's happening. So we kind of are in this terrible situation that's completely contradictory, where everybody knows that that's what's happening. And if you speak to Albanian nationals, they will tell you how frightened they are and how they grew up from a young age. You know, people are often asked when it comes to the asylum system, if they say, I couldn't go to the authorities for protection if I returned, they'll be asked why. And they'll say, well, because of corruption. And they'll be asked, well, how do you know about this corruption? Who told you? What have you seen? And often they can't answer. They'll say, it just is. And that's the thing, is they don't have concrete examples of when they were told or how they know, because they all just know. It's just so widely known that you don't need to have experienced it yourself to know that it happens. And so we're in a really, really difficult spot with Albanian asylum seekers, particularly survivors of trafficking, for those of us who support them, because a grant of a positive conclusive grounds decision from the NRM for most nationalities confers some form of protection. What we are seeing is Albanians are the only nationality who are routinely being recognised as victims of trafficking by the NRM through a conclusive grounds decision, and then having their asylum claims certified as clearly unfounded. That does not happen. I mean, I've talked to other professionals within the human trafficking sector a while back when this first started happening, who were completely blown away by that, saying, what do you mean? You can't certify the asylum claim of a victim of trafficking. The very fact that they are a victim of trafficking proves that they have some protection needs. They have a right to have those needs listened to and to have their claims heard. So Albania is the only country in which that is routinely and systemically happening, despite the Home Office having recognised that there absolutely are links with organised crime right through, you know, the Albanian political system.
That is wild. It's wild that on the one hand they're like, yeah, this country's totally corrupt, you can't have this person, politicians are bought off, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other hand, they're like, yeah, it's totally safe. Yeah, send people back. Try a different police station if you've experienced corruption there. That is so wild. And so I just want to check I understand what you mean here. When you said it's certified, that means they can't have an appeal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really, really draconian system. It's supposed to apply to a list of safe countries, and Albania has been added to that list of safe countries, where there's just no reason that a person would need to claim asylum, and that their claim is effectively so clearly unfounded, so clearly without substance, that it was always bound to fail. I mean, in layman's terms, it basically means it would be a waste of the court's time to even hear this case, because there's absolutely no chance of it succeeding. That simply isn't the case with Albania. And what's really interesting is the Illegal Migration Act, which passed in 2023, added Albania to this list of safe countries from which actually not only will their asylum claims be refused, but if and when this particular provision comes into force, Albanians actually will be barred from even claiming asylum and from entering the identification system, the NRM. They won't even be able to do that. So they're being kind of refused those protections. But certification is supposed to be only in cases where there's absolutely no chance you could have any protection needs. The UN, when Albania was added to the list of safe countries in the Illegal Migration Act, the UN said, this is concerning. We're concerned by this. You shouldn't be doing this, because it's so categorically not the case. No one is saying, and this is what the right-wing media and politicians seemed to be suggesting, is that, you know, all of us woolly, liberal, lefty, tofu-eating wokarati activists, we want, you know, every single Albanian to be able to come here and bring spurious asylum claims and blah, 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 right? Nobody's saying that. What we're asking for is for Albanians to be able to have their asylum claims heard and assessed on the same basis as anyone else. We just want their claims to be heard the same way as all other claims get heard. This process of certification is not appropriate for Albanian asylum claims, and particularly not for claims by people who've been survivors of trafficking.
Yeah, that's really, really crazy. Like, I realised we're not really talking about what kind, like, specifically what are people being trafficked for, like Albanians? Is it like slave labor or sexual exploitation or all of them, everything? Like, is there specific things that they're being targeted to do?
It's a little of everything. So Albanian women are primarily trafficked for sexual exploitation. Albanian men are predominantly trafficked for labour and criminal exploitation. One of the issues that we can't skirt around is the fact that the UK cocaine and cannabis markets are dominated by Albanian organised crime groups. That is simply a fact of life. The government's kind of plan for tackling that is unfortunately to then tackle the very victims of those organised crime groups. I think it's really worth remembering that people who are at the head of these organised crime groups are not getting in small boats. They're not risking their lives. And yet it's the people who come on the small boats and the people who are forced to work for them who are arrested, imprisoned and punished. And so the primary issue that we're seeing is sexual exploitation of women, but in even greater numbers, criminal and labour exploitation of men. So they are brought to the UK and either made to work in construction or car washes. I really think you need to ask yourself, if you are able to get your car fully washed and detailed for £5, how much is the person who's doing that work getting paid? Be really, really mindful of industries like that. But the other major issue is drug dealing. You know, there's no way around it. It's people forced into residential cannabis grow houses. So what often happens is that a residential property will be taken over by a gang who will turn it into a cannabis grow house, and they will bring someone over. And the way it usually works is what we call debt bondage. So a person will be told that they owe this gang a huge amount of money, either because they or a family member have taken out a loan that now needs to be repaid, or because they had issues in Albania with their living situation that made them feel unsafe. They came up with an agreement to come to the UK for a price. They couldn't afford it, so they were fronted the money, and then on arrival in the UK they're told this is what you have to do to pay us off. And whether the person wants to do it or not, they have to do it. And these debts are often increased and increased and increased. They become impossible to ever pay off. So people are forced into these residential grow houses to grow cannabis. They are forced into street dealing and often not recognised as victims. So I have a Google alert set up for particular keywords relating to this issue. And I mean, I had a story hit my inbox a couple of days ago that said, you know, Albanian cannabis farmer sheds blood and £10 notes as he tries to climb off a roof because he'd been attacked and he was terrified. And the crux of that story is that he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for his involvement in that operation, despite it being very, very, very clear that he was a victim of trafficking who'd been forced into that environment. It says, you know, he owed a debt, he was taken to this place, he was forced to work there, he was attacked, he was underfed, he wasn't paid, and then he was caught and sentenced to prison. So this is what we mean when we say we're punishing the survivors of these crimes, because they are brought in, forced into these environments, and you know the Home Office is promoting, you know, its latest raids on illegal working. A lot of the people they're going to be picking up are people who are trapped in exploitative labour environments, but those people are being detained and threatened with removal.
Yeah, it's really tragic, isn't it? Like targeting the victims of trafficking is obviously just shocking, but it just empowers the gangs, doesn't it? It empowers the gangs to keep people trapped, and it gives them like a pretty much constant supply of people. Like it does nothing to stop the gangs, right?
No, absolutely. And actually, they're more powerful than ever because gangs have always used the immigration system against survivors. So they will say, you know, you can't come forward and ask for help because they'll arrest you, because they'll deport you. No one will believe you. This is classic. This is trafficking 101. Everyone knows that's how they do it. But what's gotten so much worse, particularly for Albanian survivors over the last couple of years, is those traffickers can pull up the gov.uk website and show their victims the very policy that says, if you come forward, no one will help you. So we have completely emboldened and empowered these groups to keep these people exploited, trapped, with no way out.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's just a horrible situation. And why? I think we should talk about the missing children in a minute. But are why do you think they've specifically gone after Albania? Like, there's loads of. Be careful what I say there. I was going to say there's a lot of people that come into the UK. There's actually not that many, but compared to other countries, right? But why Albania specifically?
No, you're right that actually not that many people come. Last year, 20,000 people arrived by small boats. That's not that many people. 3 times as many people saw Taylor Swift in a single night at Wembley last month.
Which is a great statistic.
Right? These are just not unmanageable numbers. I mean, per capita, we are the 20th in Europe for number of asylum seekers that kind of come to the country. So, one, the numbers are not unmanageable. But on the question of why are Albanians being targeted, I think the reason is that the small boats crisis, which I should be clear, when I use the term crisis, this is a crisis for the people in the boats, not for the UK. This is by no means a crisis for the UK. This is perfectly manageable. We're just managing it badly. What it is extremely dangerous and a major crisis for the people who are forced to travel this way. But this small boats crisis came about because of increased securitisation at the French border. And what happens is when you make a route more difficult, it forces people into difficult and generally more dangerous routes. So we made the lorry route more difficult. People were taking more dangerous lorry routes, which led to things like the horrific incident in Grays in Essex, where 31 people were found dead in the back of a lorry. And so as those routes have become unviable, the gangs don't stop. They just change their model. And so they shifted from lorries to boats. Now, the thing with that is that boats are much more visible than lorries. And so we were kind of in the final dying years of this Tory government, which had totally failed the public on every measurable living standard. And they needed someone to blame. And suddenly you had this very visible arrival of people on our shores. And migrants have always been the scapegoat when governments are failing their people. And the thing that our government is particularly bad for is they like to keep things very simple. They like to flatten complexity, right? They like a slogan, protect the NHS, get Brexit done, stop the boats. And they take these huge complex issues and flatten them into these very simple slogans. Albania is an extremely complex country and people's reasons for coming are very complex. But when you're talking, sound bites, slogans, Albania is a safe country, it's really easy for that complexity to get flattened and to oversimplify the issue. And so Albanians were a very easy target and a very easy scapegoat, right? They could be held up as an example. These are people from a safe, prosperous European country. They're an EU accession country. They've got no reason to be here. The ones that are here, they're the number 1 foreign national offender population in UK prisons. It was all very oversimplified, and it really flattened the complexity of the issue. And what then happened was, by using Albanians as a scapegoat, the government was able to crack down on asylum and modern slavery protections more widely, because when they wanted to, send everyone to Rwanda and stop processing everyone's asylum claims, they were able to say, well, look, you've got all these Albanians coming. This is proof that the system is open to all this abuse. So we've got to crack down on it for everyone. So I think the reason for the targeting of Albanians was because they made an easy scapegoat and the government wanted something easy.
Yeah, it's really tragic. I really hate those slogans on the front of when politicians are speaking to the media, there's often a slogan in front of their stand or whatever. I really, it's like quite a new thing that's been going on for maybe 10 years or something. But it just looks it really annoys me for some reason.
I think the reason it bothers me is that it treats the British public like they're stupid.
Yeah.
And that's what really bothers me. And it's bothered me on the Albanian issue because, in my personal life and my professional life and the people I speak to, they've heard what the government has said about Albanians. And much like you inviting me on the podcast, which I really appreciate, it has often been people saying, I don't really understand this issue. Can you explain it? And when you explain it to people, they go, oh my God, I had no idea. This is really terrible. But the government hasn't allowed people to hear that complexity. And I think it treats people like they're stupid, like they don't want to look deeper into issues. And I simply don't believe that the majority of the British public is stupid. And I think if they are presented with the correct information, they would hold a different view. But there's kind of been this very concerted campaign to make sure they don't get all the right information.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a very big issue, isn't it? So there was something. Yes, as you were talking now, I thought there's a question I need to ask you towards the end. I've just typed that out. But before we go on to those, let's talk about the missing children. So I remember I think it was like 2022 or 23 or something. There was children that were being held at I think it was in Kent or something at a hotel, and like 100 or so kids went missing. That these were migrant kids or asylum seekers. I think some of them were most of them were Albanian. Can you tell us about that? And I think it's gotten worse, right?
Well, it got worse and then it got better, but I'll explain why it got better. It was several hotels. I think we found there were 6 hotels in total. What happened was that when a child arrives in the UK on their own, they are supposed to be taken into care of the local council that picks them up. Now, after kind of small boat arrivals increased, that council became Kent. Kent has always taken the most children into its care, but it got really, really high once the small boat arrivals started. And Kent basically said, we're not taking any more of these kids into our care. We don't have capacity, we can't do it. And so they refused. And the Home Office came up with the genius solution, well, we'll just do the same thing for them that we've been doing with adults. We'll put them in hotels. Except children are children. They are not the same as adults. They have very different needs. And so the Home Office contracted these hotels, put children in them. The children were terrified. What's come out in various reporting since is that environment was just horrendous. It was so neglectful. It was so terrifying for these children. And it became public knowledge. And some of the locations of the hotels were made public. Several extremely irresponsible media outlets, in fact, published the names and photos of the hotels that were being used to house children.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, and then there was shock and awe when these children started going missing. And it wasn't 100 or so, it was hundreds. It was something around 400 children went missing from these hotels. They disappeared. And at the last count, 154 had never been found. 135 of that number were Albanian. So 88% of the children who went missing from those hotels and have never been found are Albanian teenage boys. Now, that is absolutely linked to these exploitation risks that I've been talking about, to children being incredibly vulnerable, being in neglectful environments and having someone approach them and say, I can get you out of here, I can get you work. Listen, the government's already been clear they're not going to give you protection. Look at all these news stories, look at all these papers and policies they're putting out. They're not granting protection to Albanians, they're going to deport you. What do you want? Do you want to be deported and sent back to Albania with all these debts hanging over you where people are going to find you? Or do you want to come with me and I'll get you a job? And these kids went missing in their hundreds, and more than 100 have never been found. And what I found particularly difficult, and I realise this is, a particular interest of mine and a particular bugbear of mine. I am not saying that Albanian children or Albanian nationals should be given any special dispensation. They should be treated with any more care than any other migrant group, right? I've worked with all groups of refugees for years. They all need care and protection. But what bothered me about this particular issue was that nobody seemed to want to address the elephant in the room, which was that the majority of the kids who went missing were Albanian. That is a very targeted, very specific issue. And they talked about it as, well, they're 16 and 17 years old, they're not that young, they're all boys, they're all Albanian, as if that meant they weren't at risk. Whereas what I've seen in my practice is some of the Albanian boys that I've worked with who've been trafficked and exploited are incredibly traumatized. I've seen some of the most horrific things you can imagine. We act like these boys aren't vulnerable because they're being forced into labour exploitation or forced criminality. That simply isn't the case. We do a really bad job of recognising vulnerability, particularly of boys and young men. I mean, those cannabis farms are horrifying environments. The stories I've heard from people in them, the violence that, sexual abuse is absolutely rife. Boys are raped to force them to stay in those places. They are humiliated, they are tortured, they are beaten, they are kept in debt bondage. These environments are horrifying, and we have done a really, really poor job of recognising that vulnerability and of trying to find those kids, those 154 kids. That was at last count. The number may have changed since then. We don't have the most up-to-date numbers. But in my opinion, enough wasn't done to find them. What did end up happening, the reason I can say it got better, is not because of any concerted political effort to find these children or make it better. It's because the Home Office was taken to court. The Home Office and Kent County Council, in fact, were taken to court. ECPAT UK, which is a brilliant anti-child trafficking charity that does loads of policy and advocacy work, took the Home Office and Kent County Council to court and won every count of that case, which said Kent had acted unlawfully by refusing to take children into their care. Effectively, as a local council, when a child rocks up on your door and is alone and needs care, nothing in the Children Act says you're allowed to just say no and deny them care. That's wildly unlawful. So Kent was found to be acting unlawfully. The Home Office was found to be acting unlawfully by accommodating them. And so the hotels were shut down and are no longer operational, not because of any concerted desire to stop these children from going missing and being exploited, but because they were taken to court.
Has there been any attempts to find these kids? There probably is, but has that been public at all?
I think it really varies. There's because it's children. Obviously, there's a lot that can't be known publicly. But I think part of the problem is that if a child is in the care of a local council and they go missing, there is a strategy in place for what happens. These children, because they were in this legal grey area where it wasn't a grey area, it was unlawful, but in terms of their status as children in care, because they kind of existed in this limbo, it's not really known what the procedure was for finding them. And so it's different police forces, it's different councils, it's different people were responsible. There was no kind of national response to this. It's all handled by the area that the children went missing from. So we truly just don't know what's being done to find them.
It's an unbelievable scandal. I remember that story disappearing, and I just at the time remember thinking there's not enough attention on this. This is unbelievable, like what's happened here. It's so unbelievable. That situation is so depressing, and yeah.
It is. It's. I mean, it should have been a huge scandal. I mean, that should have been a news-leading, career-ending for certain Home Secretaries scandal. The fact that it didn't go anywhere to this day baffles me. I think it speaks a lot to how we view migrant children. And I think the government was really clever. Whether they did it on purpose or not, I don't know. But the fact that they were at the time targeting Albanians and saying they have no right to be here at the exact same time as all these kids were going missing and the majority of them were Albanian, I think it did almost allow for this lack of empathy towards them, because we'd already been so desensitised to the plight of Albanians that then when it was kids and when they were all going missing, politicians were able to stand up and say, well, they're all Albanian 16, 17-year-olds. And it was almost like the attitude was, well, yeah, it's sad, but oh well.
Yeah, I think about this quite a lot. Less, I used to think about it much more, but when there's I often think about the differences between the way that people look at governments and officialdom basically looks at Ukrainian refugees. Quite rightly, it supports them and does lots of things for them, and that's great, and that's what we should be doing. But then when it's people from Africa or Asia, they're treated completely differently. They're not given the same sort of empathy, the official empathy that they get. And it feels like this with Albania as well. Like, it's like, oh yeah, they're only Albanian kids. Who cares? It's just so terrible.
And it's wild because it's about this process of othering, right? Because it was often said the reason for the government's response to Ukrainians is because they're white. Well, Albanians are white Europeans. It's not specifically about race. It's about othering of people in migration, right? It was about who is different to us, who do we see as being with us, and who do we see as being against us. And this is absolutely drawn along racial lines. Absolutely. If you are black, if you are Asian, if you are from, a person of colour from a different part of the world, absolutely, you get the shaft. But there is also this ability to other groups. We saw it during the Brexit referendum with Romanians. We saw it with Polish people. We're seeing it with Albanians. It's about who is the in-group and who is the out-group. Who can we other as being different to us? And everyone who is different must be kept away.
Yeah, that's just really bleak. And so on this bleak point, I think I would like to ask you, like, what can we do to improve the situation? I know obviously the governments need to sort this out and do stuff, but, what can we do?
I think what we can all do is not let this go, is advocate for people, is not let ourselves be divided. Not say, well, this is one cause that matters to me and this one cause and this one group doesn't matter to me. Those of us who support Albanians are asking for nothing more than for their claims to be considered fairly in the same way anyone else's would be. We're not asking for any special treatment. We are asking for the same treatment. And so what we would ask is that everybody else who has a voice and who has the power to speak on this issue does the same. Ask for all asylum claims for all nationalities to be considered fairly. Ask for there to be a fair and efficient protection system. Ask for improvements to, the accommodation system. People shouldn't be living in hotels. People who are living in hotels are at really high risk. We need to stop this scapegoating of migrants, of people seeking safety. Because although our conversation today has focused primarily on the issue of Albanian asylum seekers, the fact is every asylum seeker, every migrant, every refugee is being treated appallingly right now. And those systems that affect everyone have specific repercussions for specific groups, right? And so when we talk about Albanians, we talk about survivors of trafficking, those people would benefit from improvements across the board, the same improvements that everybody needs. So I think the ask is for solidarity. The ask is for solidarity across causes and across communities, for everybody to be standing together. And when you see that one group is being targeted for discrimination, I think we all need to stand up and say that's not right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think knowing about it is one thing, and then trying to spread awareness of the situation is another important thing to do, right? Like you're saying, it's about solidarity and getting this message out. And I think you're doing a brilliant job with that, Lauren. And I hope this podcast does something like that as well.
I hope so too.
So before I ask you my last question, was there anything else you wanted to talk about, Lauren? We've talked about a lot, but I was trying to write down everything we spoke about on the phone the other day to make sure we get it all in. But was there anything else you wanted to discuss?
No, I think that about covers everything. I think, I just continually want to make that point around asking for everyone to be treated the same and given the same consideration and care that they all need based on their individual needs.
And so my very last question is a question I ask everyone at the end of the podcast. How do you see the future with this particular situation? And I like it, but I don't always get this when I ask people this question, but I like a little bit of hope at the end of this podcast. But if there is no hope, you can say that's fine, but it'd be great if you could, dash a little bit of hope in there. So how do you see the future progressing in this situation?
Trying to bring a little bit of hope is really difficult because I can't see any improvements on the horizon at the moment on this issue in particular. Albanians are a very easy scapegoat. The new government has made it very clear that their intention is to be equally as harsh but more competent than the last when it comes to its treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. I think the only glimmer of hope there is that there are people in government now who do care about human rights and who do care about protecting people who need it. And I really, really hope that we can work with those people to try and improve the situation, because I don't believe anybody goes into these systems, of, protecting people and recognising their vulnerability to then toss them aside. I think that there are people there who genuinely care, and I hope we can work productively with those people to try and resolve this issue. I have more hope for that than I did previously. Whether or not that gets us anywhere, I don't know. I think the hope that I find in this issue is in the young people that I work with. The people that I spend my day with are extraordinary. They are smart, they are funny, they are kind, they are sweet, they are just the best of us. And that's not just Albanians, that's all of the young people I've worked with. I see hope in them because they are the ones who are going to shape the world as we move into the future. So I have hope through them.
I always find hope in the fact that that there is people that oppose this. So that means I feel like as long as we act like there is hope, there will be. And that's one thing I like. So I like to see these activist groups and people like yourself who are, doing something and talking about it, raising the issue, fighting against the way people on the move are treated. So that's how I often find hope in that.
Yes, I think that's a lovely way to see it.
And so, Lauren, how can people follow you? Is there anywhere that people could see either your work or I think you do some media appearances and stuff?
Yes, so the best way to follow that kind of thing is to follow me on the app that was formerly known as Twitter.
Yes, I hate calling it X.
Yes, I am at Lauren H. Starkey, Starkey. That's where I kind of do my ranting about this issue. Professionally, I'm in a bunch of different places, but if you kind of want to keep up with my public rantings on this issue, that's where you'll find me.
Right, brilliant. That was such a great interview, Lauren. Thank you very much. And I'll be in touch.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Hi, it's Ben here, editing Ben from the future. Just to let you know, this podcast is not over. We have an addendum right now. So yeah, keep listening and enjoy. So this is a few days later from our interview, which was Monday. Today is Wednesday as of recording. I think it was Monday. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Whatever day it was, we're doing a little bit of an addendum here because the day after we did the interview, I think it was, Labour went to, not Labour, Keir Starmer, the new Labour Prime Minister of Britain, went off to Italy and met with Giorgia Meloni, who's a far-right leader, as far as I'm concerned, in Italy. And yeah, they were talking about, Labour was there because he wanted to learn how Meloni's government has lowered arrivals into Italy and he wants to do more upstream work. Because I think Italy's been involved in doing deals with Turkey and Libya and other places. But yeah, I wanted to get your opinion on that, Lauren. Because there was reports of Labour maybe cut on a deal with Albania to send asylum seekers there, and that happened straight after our interview. And I thought we've got to get her back on.
I'm glad to be back on. Yeah, I think the likelihood of the UK government doing a deal with Albania, I don't think is very high. And I base that purely off of when they were shopping around for the Rwanda deal, or the deal that ultimately Rwanda went for. They floated Albania as a possibility then, and the Albanian government came out very clearly and said they wouldn't do it. The reason the Albanian government have done this deal with Italy is all about the kind of the close links between Albania and Italy. Historically, these are two countries that have worked in partnership and maintained a very close relationship. So it's less surprising that they would do this kind of deal with Italy. I don't think it's very likely that they would do one with the British government. I think the British government would, from the conversation we've just had, part of the problem would be, well, where are they going to send the Albanian asylum seekers? They can't send them to Albania for processing. I think you're absolutely right in defining Maloney's government as far right. They absolutely are, and their migration plans are. The deal that they've done with Albania is a disaster waiting to happen. So their intention is to have processing, reception and detention centres in Albania. But it's not entirely clear how due process will be followed, because what they've said is they will send adult men from designated safe countries to Albania to processing. Now, that takes us back into the entire discussion that we've just had, right? Is what is a safe country? Safety is so subjective. Lots of people say Albania is a safe country, but we grant protection to a lot of Albanians. And so if these men from these countries are being sent to Albania for processing, who is going to have oversight of that? What's the judicial system? What's the appeals system? How are they going to, one of the basic tenets of, the Convention on Human Rights is that everyone has a right to a fair trial. So how are they going to have their cases heard once they're there? The other thing, of course, is that offshoring is extremely costly, is ripe for human rights abuses, and it's cruel to the people trapped in it. And when Italy says they will only send adult men, if you look at the UK's NRM statistics, which is where we recognise victims of trafficking, the greatest proportion of people trafficked from Albania are adult men. So when they're saying, adult men are less vulnerable, therefore we're going to send them all to Albania, simply being adult and a man does not make a person invulnerable. And in some circumstances, it can have very specific vulnerabilities that make people more at risk. So the deal that Italy has done with Albania is really worrying. And I think our current Labour government looking to do the same thing is an indication of just how far the debate on migration has shifted. I mean, if you think 10 years ago, can you imagine having conversations about people who have protection needs, people from Afghanistan, Sudan, Syria, these countries? There are questions being asked about, these people who we can't send home because their countries are safe, what's our plan for them? Where are we going to send them? All these discussions of offshoring. That's wild. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having that discussion because, of course, the answer is if their home countries aren't safe, we keep them here. We grant them protection and let them rebuild their lives here. So the fact that we are having this discussion that's shifted really rightward at the exact same time as our Prime Minister is meeting with far right, hard right leaders, and that they are all following this Fortress Europe model of keeping as many people out as possible is a really, really depressing indicator of where we've come. And it's also a catastrophe for people in need of protection who are trapped in it.
Yeah, it's really grim. It's really like people talk about the Overton window, and it's like the debate has shifted so far to the right that this has seemed like a sensible thing to do, which is just outrageous.
Absolutely. And I think what I have found frustrating with the new government is they are taking an approach on this issue which is totally lacking in leadership. What they seem to be doing is saying, we sort of think we've taken the temperature of the British public and we sort of think they're relatively anti-migration. I mean, a lot of polling doesn't support that, for a start, particularly around issues like right to work. The vast majority, cross-party, of British public members support giving asylum seekers the right to work, but Labour won't entertain it. And so they've really shifted rightward on these issues, which is a worry and shows a kind of real lack of leadership, because what they should be doing is standing up and saying, this is what the evidence tells us will work. These are the community integration schemes. These are the safe routes. And they might be popular with some people at first. I'm sure Farage and Tice and Anderson and the other Reform MPs will be giving it to them in the neck in Parliament. And I'm sure they will get a roasting in the press. But leadership is about saying, We recognise that this might be unpopular at first, but it will work. And what this new Labour government seems to be doing is doing things that will make them really, really unpopular in terms of the impact that it has on ordinary people's lives, and actually making things a lot worse. They are not willing to be unpopular on things that will actually make the situation better. And I think it's really cowardly.
Yeah, it's very cowardly. And the thing that was really annoying me was like they talk about, Starmer was talking about how they want to learn how Italy's lowered arrivals. I think that's what he said. And just like one of the reasons they've lowered arrivals into the country across the Mediterranean is because they keep stopping the boats, and they kept the boats out of the sea longer, which is like a real evil genius thing to do, like still evil. Yeah, and it's just I hate that that's an inspiration. It's just gross.
It is, and also it's also really worth talking about what happens in Libya, because when they talk about stopping boats crossing the Med and stopping people getting to Italy, what that involves is forcing people to stay in Libya. Now, I've been doing this job for, I don't know, years now. Some of the most horrific stories I've ever heard in my life have been about what has happened to people in Libya. Libya, in terms of this migration issue, is being run by these militias. People are being sold into slavery, they are tortured, they are killed. The conditions for migrants trying to pass through Libya are unimaginable. And if our Prime Minister is saying that he is looking to Italy as an example of keeping people out, and that to do so, they're willing to sanction keeping people in these environments where they are being tortured and killed, then I think that's something we all need to be really, really worried about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there was something else I wanted to ask, but it's going from my brain. Boats. Yeah. So I mean, this is an obvious thing, but like sending people, like Albania is obviously nothing like Libya, but Libya has got state involvement. But there's, Libya. I think there's reports of Libyan government officials being involved, and definitely the militia, in human trafficking. And that's a similarity, I suppose, that Albania has with Libya. Obviously, it's much worse in Libya. But so I think it just seems to me like sending people to sending people to Albania will benefit the traffickers.
100%. I mean, this is all their Christmases come at once. And in terms of the conditions, no, of course you can't compare Albania to Libya. But what you can say is that there is evidence in Albania of corruption, of state collusion in human trafficking. There have been arrests of high-ranking officials who have colluded in human trafficking. It's extremely well known, border guards, helping smuggle people out and this kind of thing. It is known that there is state complicity in trafficking from Albania. And so if these state-run detention facilities full of desperate adult men who fear being returned to their home countries, want another way out, are stuck in Albania, these traffickers who exploit people and promise them work and ways out are going to go gangbusters. I mean, this is all their Christmases come at once. And it's very similar, actually, when Israel did a very similar deal with Rwanda to the one that we had to offshore people effectively and send them to Rwanda. What was known really quickly was that the vast majority of people who were sent to Rwanda went missing, and many of whom were trafficked out of Rwanda. You can't send vulnerable, desperate people to countries that are known human trafficking hotspots. And no, Albania is not Libya, but Albania is a known human trafficking hotspot. And if you are sending desperate young men there, absolutely, they are going to be ripe for exploitation.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad that. Horrible. Hopefully, I mean, they've denied, like the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has said that they're not looking at that. That's not what they're doing, but we'll see.
Certainly hope not. I think the most common sense thing to do, the most budget-friendly, cost-effective, managerial-wise, the most sensible thing to do is allow people to come here safely and process their claims quickly and fairly. I mean, that simply is the best way to run this system, and it's crazy to me that we keep coming up with these increasingly harebrained schemes about who we're going to keep out and who we're going to do deals with, when the most obvious solution is also the one that is best for the people trapped in the system. And what's really sad is that I think that's why no one will consider it, because yes, it's the best and most efficient system, but it is also perceived as being the most kind on the people who are in it. And we seem to be stuck in a race around who can be cruelest to people who really need support.
Yeah, I think you're right. Oh, well, Lauren, I think that'll do for this addendum. Thanks very much for coming back on the Silver Fleet podcast. And that's probably the quickest. I've had a few people that's been on here twice, but you're you've done it quickest more than anyone before the episodes even come out.
That's quite an honour.
Well, Lauren, thanks very much. It was great to talk to you again, and before it was brilliant. Thanks a lot.
And you, thanks, Ben.
All right, that was episode 62 of the Silver Fleet podcast. Thanks once again to Lauren for coming on the episode and being a brilliant guest. And also thanks for doing that addendum a few days after our interview. What did we talk about at the end of the episode? Oh yes, so hopefully next month I'm going to be able to get 2 episodes out. I might actually be able to squeeze another one out this month, but we'll see how that goes. Go check out the blog, silverfleet.com. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, I've not been updated very much recently. I haven't got time to squeeze it in. You might not know this, but I also work full-time for a newspaper in the UK, and squeezing in the Silver Fleet stuff and the podcast and working is kind of hard at the moment for me. So hopefully I'll be able to pick that stuff back up soon. Anyway, the podcast, we'll keep doing that, keep trucking along with the podcast, and we should have some more episodes soon. Another thing we'd like to talk about at the end of the podcast is how you can help us to continue to platform the amazing people we have on here. If you would like to help us to continue to platform the activists, the journalists, the campaigners, the lawyers, the refugees, the people on the move, all the kinds of people we've had on here, then you can do so by making a small donation at ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com. You might notice, unlike other podcasts, there are no adverts on this thing whatsoever. And I want to keep it that way. So yeah, go to ko-fi.com/silverfleet and you can make a small donation there. Also, share the podcast around, tell your friends about it. Let's get this podcast more known about. I think it's worth it, and I think the people we have on here deserve to have their voices heard. Anyway, that's the end of this episode, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, bye-bye.